Danny Marshall had spent over a decade running into burning buildings while others ran out. Firefighting wasn't just his job, it was his whole life. He had no wife, no kids, and barely any personal attachments. His crew at Station 17 were the closest thing he had to a family, and that was enough for him. At 35, Danny was known for his sharp instincts and fearless attitude. Some called him reckless, but he simply didn't hesitate when lives were on the line. His experience made him a natural leader, someone who stayed calm even in the worst situations. But despite all the fires he had faced, something about this call felt different. The alarm rang just after midnight. Danny was already half awake, his body trained to respond before his mind fully caught up. He pulled on his gear and climbed into the fire truck as the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. Structure fire at Willow Creek Road. House fully engulfed. No confirmed occupants. Danny frowned. Willow Creek was isolated, with only a few scattered homes. Fires there were rare. As they sped toward the scene, his gut told him this wouldn't be a normal call. When they arrived, the house was a raging inferno. Flames twisted unnaturally, moving as if they had a mind of their own. The heat was overwhelming, but something else felt off. The roof should have collapsed, yet parts of the structure remained strangely intact. Thick black smoke curled into the sky in eerie patterns. "Marshall, take the east side," Captain Carter ordered. Danny nodded, gripping his axe as he moved through the burning wreckage. Room by room, he searched for survivors, his breath steady despite the suffocating heat. Then in the back of the house, where the fire hadn't touched, he saw it. A metallic pod, smooth and glowing faintly, sat in the center of the floor. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. As he stepped closer, his skin tingled with an unexplainable energy. The second his hand touched the surface, the pod hummed to life. And then it began to open. Danny froze as the metallic pod hissed, releasing a thin stream of mist. The surface, smooth and reflective, pulsed with a faint blue glow. He had seen many strange things in his years as a firefighter, but nothing like this. This wasn't some fireproof safe or high-tech survival chamber. This was something else entirely. His radio crackled. "Marshall, report. Do you have any survivors?" Danny hesitated, his instincts warring with logic. I found something," he finally responded. "Not sure what it is." As he reached out again, the pod seam split apart, revealing its occupant. Inside, curled up in a fetal position, lay a woman. Or at least, she looked like a woman, except for the fact that her skin shimmered like liquid silver, reflecting the flickering firelight. Her long, flowing hair seemed weightless, floating as if suspended in water. Danny's pulse quickened. Whoever she wasn't human. Then her eyes opened. They glowed, a deep luminescent blue, like distant stars burning in the void. She blinked slowly, focusing on him, and then, in a voice that sent a strange shiver down his spine, she spoke. "You saved me." Before Danny could respond, a powerful tremor shook the house. The fire, which had eerily avoided this part of the structure, suddenly surged forward, as if something had been holding it back. Danny didn't have time to process what was happening. He acted on instinct, scooping the woman into his arms. She was surprisingly light, her body warm against his, despite the chaos around them. "Hold on," he muttered, carrying her toward the exit as flames roared hungrily behind them. As they burst through the collapsing doorway into the cool night air, Danny felt it in his gut. This fire wasn't an accident, and whoever this woman was, she was the reason it had started. Danny sat in the dimly lit hospital room, arms crossed as he stared at the unconscious woman in the bed. He had seen some strange things in his career, but nothing compared to this. The doctors had no idea what to make of her. She looked human, mostly, but there were too many things that didn't add up. Her skin had an unnatural shimmer, like polished silver under the fluorescent lights. Her vitals were stable, yet the machines monitoring her kept glitching, as if struggling to process her readings. And then there was the fire. Danny had fought hundreds of fires in his life, but never one like that. The flames had been unnatural, burning hot enough to melt steel beams while leaving certain parts of the house untouched. It was as if the fire had been alive, reacting, shifting, almost thinking. And somehow this woman had been at the center of it. The hospital staff had tried to run tests, but nothing made sense. Blood samples crystallized the second they were exposed to air. X-rays failed, showing nothing but static. The lead doctor, a grizzled man with decades of experience, had finally thrown up his hands in frustration. "She's not human," he had muttered to Danny before walking away. Or at least not entirely. Danny wasn't sure what that meant, but he knew one thing. Whoever she was now his responsibility. He had been the one to pull her from the wreckage, and until someone gave him a damn good reason otherwise, he wasn't about to leave her side. He sighed, rubbing his temples. He needed answers. Then, as if responding to his thoughts, she stirred. Danny straightened in his chair, watching as her fingers twitched against the crisp white sheets. A soft hum filled the air, so faint he wasn't sure if he was imagining it. Her breathing deepened, and then slowly she opened her eyes. Blue. Not just blue. Luminous, glowing from within like distant stars burning in the night sky. They locked onto him instantly, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Danny swallowed hard. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice steady. "You're awake." She blinked, her expression unreadable. Then without warning, she sat up, her movements unnaturally fluid, like water shifting in zero gravity. The machines around her beeped wildly in protest. Danny tensed. "Take it easy. You were in a fire. You saved me," she interrupted. Her voice was soft, musical, carrying a strange resonance that sent a shiver down his spine. Danny hesitated. "Yeah, I guess I did." Something flickered in her gaze, something ancient and unreadable. Then, to his complete and utter shock, she smiled. "Then we are bound," she said simply. "You are my husband now." Danny blinked. What?" She tilted her head, watching him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "You saved my life. The bond has been sealed." Danny stared at her, waiting for some sign that she was joking, that this was some weird misunderstanding, but she just continued looking at him, completely serious. "Husband?" he repeated, just to be sure he had heard her correctly. "Yes." "No." Her brow furrowed slightly. "No?" "Yeah, no," Danny said, shaking his head. "That's not how this works. I pulled you out of a burning building, sure, but that doesn't mean we're married." She blinked again, as if he had said something profoundly confusing. "On my world, it does." Danny exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Look, lady, I don't know what planet you're from, but here on Earth, Saving someone's life doesn't mean you automatically marry them. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You do not accept the bond? No. Because there is no bond, Danny said, exasperated. I saved you because that's my job. That's what firefighters do. She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then, to his dismay, she simply nodded. You are rejecting the formal claim. That is, unexpected. Danny pinched the bridge of his nose. It's not a claim. It's not anything. She seemed to consider that, then tilted her head. You do not wish to be my mate? Danny's brain short-circuited for a second. That's not the issue here. A strange expression crossed her face, something like curiosity mixed with amusement. Your heart rate has increased. Danny scowled. That's because this conversation is insane. She said nothing, just watching him, her glowing blue eyes full of something he couldn't define. Finally, she sighed, almost disappointed. I understand, she said. You are unprepared. This is common. Danny narrowed his eyes. Common? She nodded. Among my kind, bonds formed in life-saving situations are sacred, but it is not unusual for the chosen mate to resist at first. Danny groaned. Great. So I'm just part of some intergalactic tradition I never signed up for? Her lips curved into the faintest smile. Precisely. Danny threw up his hands. Unbelievable. The door to the hospital room suddenly swung open, cutting off any further argument. A nurse stepped inside, looking slightly hesitant. There are some people here to see her, she said carefully. They say it's urgent. Danny's stomach clenched. People? Who the hell knew she was here? The woman in the bed, his so-called wife, immediately tensed, her glowing eyes darkening. They found me. Danny didn't like the sound of that. Who found you? He asked, already reaching for the fire department-issued radio on his belt. She turned to him, her expression serious. My captors. Danny swore under his breath. Whatever was happening, he had a feeling his night was about to get a lot worse. Danny barely had time to process what she'd just said before the tension in the room thickened. The way she sat up, her glowing blue eyes darting toward the door, made every instinct in his body scream that something was very, very wrong. She looked like someone ready to run or fight. Start talking, Danny muttered under his breath, shifting slightly in his chair. Who are they? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, and when they opened again, her expression was calmer, but not at ease. They are the ones who tried to keep me imprisoned, she said. They will take me again if they can. Danny frowned. Imprisoned? You mean the fire was not an accident, she finished for him. A chill crawled down his spine. The fire had already felt unnatural, but now he was hearing it straight from the source. His gut had been right. Something about this whole thing was wrong, but he hadn't realized just how deep it went. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Danny could hear voices outside the room. Male, clipped tones, someone in charge giving orders, not hospital staff. You need to stay here, Danny said firmly, pushing himself up from his chair. But she was already moving. He barely had time to react before she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, flowed, onto her feet. She was fast, too fast for someone who had been unconscious a few minutes ago. There was no hesitation, no stiffness, just precise, fluid motion. I cannot, she said simply. Danny stepped in front of her, blocking her way. You're in a damn hospital bed, and you think you're just going to walk out of here? She tilted her head, looking at him as if he were the one not making sense. Yes. Danny clenched his jaw. Lady, I don't know what planet you come from, but on this one, you don't just get up and leave when you've got people hunting you down. Her gaze flicked to the door, then back to him. And yet, I must. The door handle started to turn. Danny had a fraction of a second to decide. Acting on instinct, he grabbed her wrist, only to feel a sharp jolt rush through him, like static electricity but deeper, pulsing through his veins. His breath hitched, but she didn't flinch. If anything, she just looked down at their joined hands and then back up at him, expression unreadable. You are reacting to the bond, she murmured. Danny gritted his teeth. Not the time. The door swung open. 2 men in suits stepped inside, their expressions unreadable, but their posture screaming authority. They weren't hospital staff. Hell, they weren't even cops. Military, maybe? Government? Either way, they were trouble. One of them, a tall man with short-cropped hair, flashed a badge that had no markings Danny recognized. Mr. Marshall, he said smoothly. We need to speak with you. Danny didn't move. He could feel the woman, Ariel, or whatever her name was, standing close behind him, radiating tension like a coiled wire. Funny, Danny said, folding his arms, because I don't remember calling for company. The second man, shorter and stockier, let out a small sigh, like he was already losing patience. We're here for the patient, he said. She's coming with us. Yeah? Danny arched a brow. And she told you that, did she? The first man smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. She's not authorized to make that decision. Danny's jaw tightened. Not authorized? You're going to have to explain that one to me, because last I checked, human beings get a say in whether or not they go anywhere with a couple of guys in suits. The second man's eyes flicked past Danny, landing on her. You know why we're here. Come quietly, and there won't be any problems. Danny felt her shift slightly behind him. No, she said simply. The tension in the room went up another notch. The first man's expression darkened slightly. Miss, I don't think you understand. Danny moved before he even realized he was doing it. One step forward, just enough to put himself directly in their line of sight, forcing them to deal with him first. She said no, he said flatly. Both men hesitated, exchanging a glance. Mr. Marshall, the taller one said, voice taking on a more warning tone. This isn't your concern. Danny gave a humorless chuckle. See, that's where you're wrong. I pulled her out of a burning building. That makes it my concern. She's not supposed to be here, the shorter one said, shifting slightly, like he was debating whether or not to escalate things. Well, she is, Danny shot back. And unless you've got a warrant or an official court order, I'm pretty sure you don't get to decide where she goes. There was a long pause. Danny wasn't stupid. He knew he was pushing his luck. These guys weren't normal law enforcement. They operated on rules that had nothing to do with due process. But there was one thing he did know. People like this weren't used to being challenged. And right now, he was buying time. Because behind him, he could feel her moving again, not stepping forward, but doing something else. A faint hum filled the air, so subtle he wasn't sure if he was imagining it. Then, without warning, the hospital lights flickered. Danny's stomach dropped. The air in the room changed, like the pressure had shifted. He knew that feeling. It was the same unnatural energy he'd felt back in the burning house, right before the pod had opened. The two men stiffened, glancing around as the machines in the room started glitching. Danny took his chance. He turned slightly, just enough to mutter under his breath, "Whatever you're about to do it now." She didn't hesitate. In the next instant, the hum turned into a sharp pulse. The lights in the room went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Danny heard the startled shouts of the two men, the shuffle of movement. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. He grabbed her wrist again, felt that same electric pulse shoot through his arm, and yanked her toward the side exit. "Move!" She moved. They burst into the hallway, just as alarms started blaring, nurses and patients reacting to the sudden blackout. Danny didn't stop to think, didn't question where they were going. He just ran, pulling her with him, adrenaline surging through his veins. And as they slipped through a staff exit into the cool night air, he realized two things. One, whoever those men were, they weren't giving up that easily. And two, he had just made himself a target. Danny drove in silence, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The woman, Ariel, as she had called herself, sat in the passenger seat, calm as ever, as if she hadn't just sent half a hospital into chaos. He could still feel the phantom pulse of energy from when he had grabbed her wrist back in the room, something unnatural humming beneath her skin. Whatever she wasn't human. And yet, she looked almost human, spoke like one, even breathed like one. But the way she carried herself, the way her glowing eyes flicked toward him with an unreadable expression, made it clear she didn't belong here. He knew he should have handed her over. He wasn't some hero in a sci-fi movie. He was just a firefighter, someone who ran into burning buildings because that was his job. Whatever was happening here, it was way above his pay grade. But for some reason, he hadn't let go of her hand when he had the chance. And now, he was in the middle of something he didn't understand. Ariel finally broke the silence, her voice smooth but questioning. "You are upset." It wasn't really a question, more like an observation, as if she could read the frustration rolling off him in waves. Danny let out a sharp breath through his nose, focusing on the dark road ahead. "Yeah, you think? I just went from putting out fires to running from what I assume are government agents. You telling me I shouldn't be upset?" She tilted her head slightly, as if processing his words. "You chose this path," she said. "You could have let them take me." Danny clenched his jaw. She wasn't wrong. He had every opportunity to step aside, to let those men in suits drag her away. But something about the way she had tensed when they entered the hospital room, the sheer certainty in her voice when she said they were her captors, made it impossible for him to do nothing. He wasn't wired that way. Maybe it was the firefighter in him, the instinct to protect people, even when it wasn't his fight. "Yeah, well," he muttered, "guess I'm just a sucker for bad decisions." Ariel studied him for a long moment before turning her gaze back to the road. "You are not like the others," she finally said. Danny frowned. "Others?" She nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the dashboard. "Most humans operate on fear. They hesitate. They seek the easiest path. You did not." Danny let out a humorless laugh. "Lady, I don't know what kind of humans you've been hanging around, but I can promise you I'm not special, just stubborn." Her glowing eyes flickered toward him again, considering, as if she could see something in him he couldn't. "Perhaps," she murmured. but she didn't sound convinced. Danny exhaled and tightened his grip on the wheel. He had to get her somewhere safe, somewhere they could regroup and figure out what the hell was going on. His cabin wasn't far, secluded, off the grid enough that no one would find them right away. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was all he had. The road stretched ahead of them, the silence settling once again. Danny wanted answers, but every time he opened his mouth to ask, the weight of everything kept him quiet. The way the fire had behaved back at the house, the way the lights flickered when she was in distress, none of it was normal. And deep down, a part of him knew that once he started asking questions, there would be no turning back. But he needed to know. "That fire," he said finally, keeping his eyes on the road. "It wasn't normal, and neither are you. What the hell happened back there?" Ariel was quiet for a long moment before she answered. "I was escaping," she said simply. "They set the fire to destroy the evidence, to destroy me." Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something heavy, almost sorrowful. Danny's fingers tightened on the wheel. "And who are they exactly?" She hesitated. "A faction that believes my kind should not exist here, that we are dangerous." Danny let out a sharp breath. "Great. So I just pissed off some secret alien hunting group? Fantastic. Really making good choices today." Ariel turned toward him then, fully facing him for the first time since they got in the truck. "You regret saving me," she said, not accusing, just stating. Danny didn't answer immediately. Did he regret it? He should. His life had been simple before tonight. Predictable, safe. Now, he was on the run with an alien woman who thought they were married, and a group of men who likely had no problem making people disappear on their tail. He should have walked away. He should have let them take her. But as he met her glowing gaze, something deep in his gut told him that even if he could go back, he wouldn't change a damn thing. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't regret saving you," he admitted. "I just don't know what the hell I'm supposed to do now." Ariel studied him for another long moment before nodding. "Then we will figure it out together," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Danny exhaled and shook his head. "Yeah," he muttered. "Somehow, I knew you were going to say that." The night stretched endlessly as Danny drove deeper into the forested outskirts, where the road turned to gravel, and the darkness felt heavier. Ariel remained silent beside him, her glowing eyes scanning the surroundings with an intensity that made his skin prickle. Every so often, she would close them, her expression unreadable, as if she were listening to something he couldn't hear. Danny had dealt with plenty of tense situations before. Fires raging out of control, ceilings collapsing inches away from crushing him, people screaming for help in the chaos. But this was different. This wasn't fire he could fight, a crisis he could control. This was something bigger, something that twisted his reality into a shape he barely recognized. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he had just made the worst mistake of his life by helping her, or the best decision he'd ever make. His cabin was nestled at the edge of an old logging road, barely more than a sturdy one-story structure with enough space for a bed, a kitchen, and a battered couch that had seen better days. It was the only place he could think of where no one would look for them, at least not right away. As he pulled up, cutting the engine, Ariel turned to him with that same unreadable expression. "This is where we will be safe?" she asked, Danny exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. For now. It's not exactly Fort Knox, but it's off the grid. No one comes out here unless they know where to look. She tilted her head slightly, considering his words, then nodded as if accepting them as fact. He still wasn't used to the way she moved. Fluid, deliberate, like she belonged to an entirely different rhythm than the rest of the world. Inside, the cabin was dark and cool. The scent of pine and old wood thick in the air. Danny flicked on the lantern near the door, casting a warm glow over the room. Ariel stepped inside cautiously, her gaze drifting over the space with quiet curiosity. She touched the worn wooden counter, ran her fingers along the faded plaid of his couch. "You live here," she observed. Danny let out a short breath, dropping his keys onto the table. "Yeah, when I'm not at the station." She nodded, seemingly content with that answer, before turning to face him fully. "You are uneasy." It wasn't a question. Danny frowned, crossing his arms. "I've got plenty of reasons to be uneasy. You being hunted by some shadow organization is at the top of the list." Ariel studied him, then took a step closer. "I will not allow them to harm you." He let out a dry laugh. "Yeah? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I just made myself their next target." Her glowing blue eyes softened slightly. "You did not have to save me," she said, her voice quieter now. "And yet, you did. That choice has meaning." Danny held her gaze, something in her tone making it impossible to look away. He wanted to say that it hadn't been a choice at all, that he had simply done what he always did, save the person who needed saving. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He had seen the way she had looked at those men in suits, the way she had tensed at the sound of their voices. She hadn't been a fugitive running from justice. She had been prey, escaping a hunter. And something in him refused to let them take her back. Danny exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I just need to know what we're up against," he admitted. "If I'm going to help you, I need the truth. All of it." Ariel hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "You deserve that." She stepped away, walking toward the window, her gaze distant. "I was not meant to be here," she said. "My kind. We do not interfere with this world. We observe. We learn. But some believe that we should do more." Danny listened, watching her as she spoke. "There are those who see our abilities as dangerous, powers that should be contained, controlled. The ones who held me." Her expression darkened slightly. "They wanted to use me, to study what I am, to turn my energy into something they could wield." Danny's stomach tightened. "And the fire?" She was silent for a moment. It was their attempt to erase the evidence of what they had done. They would rather see me destroyed than let me go free. The weight of her words settled over him, heavy and suffocating. Danny had seen the destruction that fire could bring. He had watched homes turn to ash, seen families lose everything in a matter of minutes. But the idea that someone had deliberately started a fire, not just to kill, but to erase all proof that she had even existed, it made his blood run cold. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a slow breath. "All right," he said finally. "Then we find a way to make sure they don't get another chance." Ariel turned to him, something unreadable flickering across her face. Then slowly, she nodded. "Together," she said, and somehow, despite everything, despite the danger, despite the fact that he had just thrown his entire life into chaos, Danny found himself believing her. The wind howled through the trees outside, rattling the old window panes of Danny's cabin as he sat across from Ariel, trying to process everything she had just told him. He had asked for the truth, and now that he had it, he wasn't sure he was ready to handle it. She wasn't just some escaped test subject, some government experiment gone wrong. She was something else entirely, something not from here. Danny had spent his whole life grounded in reality, in things that made sense. Fire, smoke, steel, and wood. Those were things he understood. But this? A secret war between humans and beings from beyond the stars? It was the kind of thing that belonged in conspiracy forums and late-night sci-fi movies. And yet, the proof was sitting right in front of him. Her glowing blue eyes watching him with an intensity that made it impossible to deny. Ariel had explained it all in that calm, measured voice of hers. Her kind were observers, travelers who studied other civilizations without interfering. But not all of them believed in staying hidden. Some had wanted more, control, influence, power. When they arrived on Earth, a faction of humans had discovered them, and instead of fear, they had seen opportunity. They wanted to understand their abilities, to replicate them, to turn them into weapons. Ariel had been taken as a test subject, one of many. But she was different from the others. She had something they hadn't expected, a connection to energy itself, something fundamental to her existence. They didn't just want to study her. They wanted to harness her. And when they realized they couldn't, they decided to destroy her instead. The fire had been meant to erase every trace of her. If Danny hadn't found her, she would be gone. Danny leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "So let me get this straight," he said, rubbing a hand over his face. "You were captured, experimented on, and when they couldn't figure out how to use whatever power you've got, they decided to burn the whole place down with you in it." Ariel nodded, her expression unreadable. "That is correct." Danny let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "Jesus. And here I thought my worst problem this week was going to be some dumb rookie at the station screwing up a hose drill." She tilted her head slightly. "You regret saving me?" The question was quiet, but there was something behind it, something heavy. Danny met her gaze, searching for the right words. "No," he said finally. "I don't. But I do wish I knew what the hell I'm supposed to do now." Ariel studied him for a long moment, then reached out, resting her hand on the table between them. The moment her fingers touched the wood, a faint hum filled the air. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but there. Danny felt it more than heard it, a tingling in his skin, an awareness deep in his bones. "The bond between us is not an accident," she said. "I told you before, when you saved me, you became part of this. Whether you accept it or not, your life has already changed." Danny exhaled sharply, pushing himself up from his chair. "Yeah, well, forgive me if I'm not exactly thrilled about that." He paced toward the window, looking out at the dark forest beyond. "I didn't sign up for any of this, all right? I'm not some secret agent. I'm not a soldier. I'm just a guy who fights fires." "You are more than that," Ariel said, her voice steady. "You are someone who chose to do what was right, even when it was dangerous, even when it made no sense." Danny turned back to her, frustration simmering beneath his skin. "Yeah, well, doing the right thing doesn't exactly come with a survival plan, does it?" Ariel's lips pressed together in something that almost resembled a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "No," she admitted. "It does not. Danny sighed, running both hands through his hair. He could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him, but deep down, he knew she was right. He had already made his choice. There was no going back now. Whatever happened next, he was in it. With her. He just hoped it wouldn't get them both killed. The weight of the situation pressed down on Danny like a collapsing ceiling, heavy and inescapable. He had spent years running into burning buildings, facing down death without hesitation, but this was different. Fire followed rules. It consumed, destroyed, but it was predictable. This was something he couldn't control, couldn't extinguish with water or outrun with enough speed. He had taken Ariel out of that inferno, and in doing so, he had unknowingly stepped into a war that wasn't his. And now, he had to figure out how to survive it. Ariel remained still, watching him with those luminous eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. She hadn't said much since he'd started pacing the cabin, trying to come up with a plan. Not that there were many options. Hiding wouldn't work forever, and fighting was laughable. What the hell was he supposed to do against a group that had access to technology beyond anything he understood? Call the cops? The military? Yeah, sure. He could imagine how that conversation would go. Hey, I rescued an alien from a secret government lab, and now we're being hunted. Mind giving us a hand? No, they were on their own. And if Danny was being honest, that terrified him. Ariel finally broke the silence. You are afraid, she said, not as an accusation, but as a fact. Danny let out a dry laugh, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, no kidding. I don't exactly have a rule book for what to do when you accidentally piss off a shadow organization. He exhaled sharply and turned to her. You said they want to erase you. That means they're still coming, right? She nodded once. They will not stop until I am either reclaimed or eliminated. Danny muttered a curse under his breath. Great. So we're on a timer. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You said you weren't the only one they took. Were there others like you? Anyone who got away? Ariel's expression darkened slightly, a flicker of something, pain, guilt, crossing her features. There were others, she admitted. But I do not know their fates. When I escaped, I was alone. I do not believe they survived. Her voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it that made Danny's chest tighten. He ran a hand through his hair. All right. Then we figure out how to keep you out of their hands. Long term. I'm not just going to sit around waiting for them to find us. She tilted her head slightly. You are proposing we fight? Danny scoffed. I don't know if fight is the right word. More like make it as hard as possible for them to track us down. Stay ahead of them. He frowned. Unless you've got some secret alien superpowers you haven't told me about that can just, vaporize them on the spot. Ariel hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Danny to notice. His stomach dropped. Wait, do you? She sighed, looking away. My abilities are not meant for destruction. They are meant for balance. But in desperation, they can be used as a weapon. Danny narrowed his eyes. And you didn't mention this before because, her lips pressed together, because I do not wish to use them that way. If I do, it will mark me forever. Danny wasn't sure what that meant. But the way she said it made him realize it wasn't just about morality. It was something deeper, something permanent. He exhaled. All right. So that's a last resort. He pushed off the counter. Then we need a plan. Somewhere we can go. Something we can do that doesn't involve waiting to get caught. Ariel was silent for a long moment. Then finally, she said, I may know a place. Danny raised a brow. Yeah? And why am I just hearing about this now? She met his gaze. Because if we go there, there is no turning back. You will no longer just be helping me. You will be part of this, fully and without escape. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Danny's chest tighten. Are you certain you wish to take that step? Danny stared at her, feeling the full gravity of what she was asking. He thought about his life before this night, his quiet routine, his predictable days. He thought about the fire, the way he had found her in that pod, the way she had looked at him like he was something more than just another person passing through. He thought about the men in suits, the way they had demanded she come with them like she was a possession instead of a person. And he thought about the fact that despite every instinct telling him to walk away, he couldn't. Danny exhaled. Yeah, he said, meeting her gaze. I'm in. Ariel's expression softened, just slightly, and she nodded. Then we must leave before the next sunrise. They will not stop searching for me, for us. Danny glanced toward the window, toward the dark forest beyond. He had no idea what was coming next. No idea if he was making a terrible mistake. But for better or worse, his life had already changed. There was no going back. And as terrifying as that was, a small part of him realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't running into fire just because it was his job. This time, he was choosing to stay in the flames. The road stretched endlessly ahead, dark and winding through the dense forest. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engine and the distant chorus of crickets, their rhythmic chirping almost hypnotic in the stillness of the night. Danny kept his hands tight on the wheel, his eyes scanning the road ahead, but his mind was racing. Every instinct in his body told him they were being followed. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was the fact that he had spent years honing his gut feeling when it came to danger. Whatever it was, it left his skin prickling with unease. Ariel sat beside him, unnervingly calm, her glowing eyes fixed on the passing trees. She had been quiet since they left the cabin, but he knew she wasn't relaxed. She was listening, sensing, doing whatever it was that her kind did to detect danger before it arrived. He didn't understand it, but he didn't need to. What mattered was that she was on edge too. That meant they weren't being paranoid. They were being hunted. How much further? Danny asked, his voice low. Ariel didn't look at him. Another hour, she said, if we are not intercepted before then. Danny grimaced. Reassuring. She finally turned to him, her gaze steady. I do not offer reassurances where none exist. He let out a slow breath, gripping the wheel a little tighter. Yeah, I've noticed. For a few more miles, they drove in tense silence. The trees lining the road grew taller, denser, creating tunnels of darkness that the headlights barely managed to cut through. Then, just as Danny was about to let himself believe they might actually make it, he saw it. Headlights in the rearview mirror, far back, but moving fast. Too fast. His pulse jumped. We've got company. Ariel turned sharply, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat as she peered behind them. She was quiet for a moment, but then she whispered, It's them. Danny cursed under his breath and pressed harder on the gas. The truck rumbled in response, tires gripping the narrow road as they picked up speed. The headlights behind them grew brighter, closing the distance too quickly. Whoever was driving wasn't just following them. They were coming in fast, and they weren't going to stop. Ariel's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. They will not let us reach our destination. Yeah, I figured that out, Danny muttered, scanning the road ahead. They were too far from any town, too deep into the wilderness. No backup, no help. Just him, Ariel, and whoever the hell was gunning for them. Then the headlights behind them split. 2 more vehicles emerged from the darkness, flanking the first. Danny's stomach dropped. Shit. They are trying to box us in, Ariel said, her voice tight. You cannot outrun them. Danny gritted his teeth. Watch me. He yanked the wheel sharply to the right, taking a sudden turn onto a smaller, rougher road that cut deeper into the forest. The truck bounced violently, tires skidding on loose gravel before catching traction. The headlights behind them swerved, but they didn't slow down. They were still coming. Ariel braced herself as the truck jolted over uneven ground. Danny! Hold on, he barked, cutting the wheel again as another road veered off to the left. He had spent years out here, knew these roads better than most. If he could get them to the old logging trail, they might have a chance. But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, a sudden impact slammed into the truck from behind. The force sent them skidding. Danny fought for control, the wheel jerking violently in his grip as the tires struggled against the dirt road. Another hit, this time from the side. The truck fishtailed, kicking up a cloud of dust and debris. Ariel's hand shot out, gripping the dashboard, and for the briefest second, Danny thought he saw something, her skin pulsing with light, her fingers twitching as if she were about to do something unnatural. But she stopped herself. Don't, Danny snapped, righting the truck. Not unless you have to. Her jaw tightened, but she nodded. Another set of headlights appeared ahead of them. A 4th vehicle. Danny's grip tightened. They're trying to funnel us. Ariel's gaze darted around, calculating. There is a gap between the trees to the right. If you take it, you may lose them in the terrain. May? It is your best option. Danny didn't hesitate. He yanked the wheel hard, cutting through the narrow gap she had pointed out. The truck burst through branches and underbrush, bouncing violently as they tore through uneven ground. The trees thinned slightly, and for a second, Danny thought they might have actually pulled it off. Then the world exploded. A deafening crash, metal twisting, glass shattering. The truck hit something hard, momentum launching them forward. Danny barely had time to throw an arm out to brace Ariel before everything turned to chaos. The impact sent them skidding sideways, dirt and debris flying as they spun out of control. When the movement finally stopped, the truck was still upright, but at a sharp angle, its front half buried in a ditch. The engine sputtered once before dying completely, leaving only the sound of their heavy breathing. Danny coughed, shaking off the haze. Ariel. I am unharmed, she said quickly, already turning toward the shattered window. But before she could move, footsteps crunched against the dirt outside. They weren't alone. Danny's pulse pounded. He reached for the door handle, but Ariel's hand shot out, gripping his wrist. Wait, she whispered. They do not know if we are still conscious. Danny froze, listening. More footsteps, more voices. They were close. Ariel leaned in, her voice barely audible. You must trust me. Danny exhaled sharply. Why do I feel like I'm not going to like what happens next? She didn't answer. Instead, she pressed her palm against the metal frame of the truck, and instantly, the air around them crackled with something unseen. Outside, the voices stopped. Then one by one, the headlights of the approaching vehicles flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed the forest in an instant. The headlights of the approaching vehicles flickered and died, plunging everything into an eerie silence. Danny felt it before he fully understood it. An unnatural stillness, a pressure in the air, like the charge before a lightning strike. The moment Ariel pressed her hand against the truck, the metal beneath his fingers seemed to vibrate with something deep and unseen, something beyond his comprehension. He turned his head, his breath tight in his chest, watching as her silver skin pulsed faintly with light, her glowing veins illuminating in rhythmic waves beneath the surface. This wasn't just some defensive trick. This was something raw, something powerful, something barely being contained. The men outside hesitated. He could hear them shifting, murmuring to each other in confusion. The crunch of boots on gravel grew uncertain, some slowing, others stopping entirely. Without their lights, without the power they had relied on, their advantage was slipping, and they knew it. Danny could hear it in the way they moved now, less confident, more cautious. And then, Ariel exhaled slowly, her glowing eyes lifting toward the windshield, and Danny felt the shift before he even saw it happen. The first man near the truck stumbled back, gasping like the air had been knocked from his lungs. He clawed at his throat, his knees giving out as he collapsed into the dirt. Another staggered away, swearing under his breath, his body convulsing as if something unseen had gripped him tight. Danny didn't know what she was doing, but he knew one thing. She wasn't touching them. She wasn't anywhere near them. This was something else. They were panicking now, some backing toward the trees, others trying to regroup. One of them, probably their leader, shouted something sharp, urgent, but his voice barely made it past the heavy air pressing around them. Then he too faltered, dropping to his knees like the others, gasping for breath. Danny knew this was their only chance. Whatever Ariel had done, she had bought them a window. He grabbed her wrist, ignoring the sharp jolt of electricity that ran up his arm at the contact. "We need to move," he said, voice low but urgent. "Now." She blinked once, her expression distant, almost dazed, but she nodded. The light beneath her skin dimmed slightly, as if she were pulling it back inside herself, restraining whatever force she had just unleashed. Danny shoved the door open and climbed out into the night. The air smelled charged, thick with something he couldn't name. Around them, the men lay sprawled across the dirt, some still conscious, others barely holding on. He didn't waste time wondering what had happened to them. They needed to get out of there before reinforcements arrived. He pulled Ariel with him, guiding her toward the trees, his heart hammering. His truck was useless now, but the forest offered cover, a chance to disappear. They ran. Branches lashed against Danny's arms as they pushed deeper into the undergrowth, their breaths harsh in the cool night air. He didn't know where they were going, only that they had to get as far from the crash site as possible. Ariel moved effortlessly beside him, her steps light, her balance perfect even on uneven ground. Danny's body ached, his muscles protesting after the impact from the crash, but adrenaline kept him moving. Every so often, he risked a glance back, half expecting to see flashlights bouncing through the trees, figures chasing after them. But there was nothing. just darkness and the distant sound of leaves rustling in the wind. After what felt like miles, Danny finally slowed, pressing a hand against a tree trunk to catch his breath. "All right," he panted. "I think we lost them." Ariel stopped beside him, her face unreadable in the dim moonlight. She wasn't winded. She wasn't even sweating. Whatever she was, her body worked differently. Danny wiped the back of his hand across his forehead, exhaling sharply. "You want to tell me what the hell that was back there?" Ariel hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "A warning." Danny frowned. "A warning?" Looked more like a damn exorcism. She tilted her head slightly. "They needed to understand that they should not pursue us. I showed them." Danny shook his head, rubbing his face. "You showed them something, all right. I just hope it was enough to keep them off our backs for good." He turned, glancing through the trees, making sure they were still alone. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened. Whatever Ariel had done back there, it wasn't just some defensive trick. It was power, real power. And if those men were willing to burn down a house just to erase her existence, then they sure as hell wouldn't stop after one bad encounter. He looked back at her, studying the way she stood so still, so controlled, like something carefully contained. There was a part of him that should have been afraid of her, but he wasn't. He had seen fear, real fear, in the eyes of those men back there. Whatever she had done, they had been terrified. But Danny, he wasn't. He just knew one thing. Whatever was coming next, they had to be ready. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. The night felt heavier now, pressing down on them with an oppressive silence that made Danny's skin crawl. The air was thick, charged with the lingering remnants of whatever Ariel had done back there. And even though they had put distance between themselves and the wreckage, Danny knew this wasn't over. Not yet. He could feel it, that deep, gut-wrenching certainty that they were running out of time. The men they had left behind wouldn't stay down forever, and worse, whoever had sent them wouldn't take failure lightly. Reinforcements would come. They always did. And when they did, Danny knew they wouldn't make the same mistakes. He turned toward Ariel, watching her as she stood impossibly still, her glowing blue eyes scanning the darkness beyond the trees. She looked calm, but he wasn't fooled. She was waiting, listening, preparing. Whatever came next, she knew it was already on its way. Danny exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "We can't keep running," he muttered. "They're not just going to let this go." He could feel the weight of the night pressing against his skull, the exhaustion settling deep into his muscles. He was used to pushing through fatigue, fighting fires for days on end, running on nothing but adrenaline and sheer willpower. But this was different. This wasn't just a battle against the elements, against something predictable. This was a fight he didn't know how to win. Ariel turned to him, her gaze steady. "No," she said simply. "They will not stop." Danny met her eyes, searching for something. An answer, a plan, anything. "Then we need to end this. Somehow." Ariel studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words, considering something unspoken. Then finally she nodded. "There is only one way to end this." Her voice was softer now, almost reluctant. "But it will require a choice." Danny felt a cold prickle at the base of his spine. What kind of choice? She hesitated, and that hesitation told him everything he needed to know. Whatever she was about to say, he wasn't going to like it. If I use my full power, she said carefully, I can stop them. But it will change me, and it will change you. Danny frowned. Change me? What the hell does that mean? She took a slow breath, her glowing veins pulsing faintly beneath her skin. The bond between us, it is incomplete. Right now, you are still human, still separate from me. But if I release my full energy, it will no longer be so. Danny's pulse quickened. You're saying if you do this, I stop being human? Ariel shook her head. Not entirely, but you will not be as you were. She looked away for a moment, almost hesitant. It is not something that can be undone. Danny let out a sharp breath, running a hand over his face. And the alternative? Ariel's gaze darkened. They will find us. They will capture me, and they will kill you. The words settled heavily between them, final and absolute. Danny had always known this would come down to a fight, but he had hoped, stupidly maybe, that there would be another way. Something that didn't require him to give up the last piece of normal he had left. But this was it. The final line in the sand. Either he let them take her, or he stepped into something he didn't fully understand. Something that would change him forever. Danny swallowed hard, staring at the ground as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. He had spent his life knowing exactly who he was. A firefighter, a man who ran into danger, because that's what he was built for. He had never questioned it before, never hesitated, and yet, for the first time, he realized this wasn't just about saving someone from a fire. This was about something bigger, something deeper, and maybe, just maybe, it was about saving himself too. He lifted his gaze, meeting Ariel's eyes. The answer was there before he even spoke. Do it, he said. Ariel studied him for a long moment, searching his face for doubt, for hesitation. When she found none, she reached out, placing her hands over his. The moment she made contact, a pulse of energy surged through his veins, like liquid fire coursing beneath his skin. He gasped, his knees nearly buckling, but he didn't pull away. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay upright as the air around them crackled with power. And then, everything changed. A blinding light erupted between them, swallowing everything in its brilliance. Danny clenched his jaw, his muscles locking as a wave of raw energy surged through his body, setting every nerve on fire. It wasn't pain, not exactly. More like his entire being was being rewritten, reshaped. Like something deep inside him was awakening for the first time. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, too fast, too strong, and he could feel the air around them vibrating, charged with something beyond his understanding. Ariel's hands tightened over his, anchoring him in place as the energy built, rising higher, brighter, until the forest around them disappeared into nothingness. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The light vanished, leaving behind only the sound of his ragged breathing and the faint hum of residual power in the air. Danny staggered, his vision swimming as he tried to regain his balance. Everything felt different. The world was sharper, clearer, every sound amplified, every breath of wind against his skin carrying weight. He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers, expecting something alien, something monstrous, but they were still his hands, still human. And yet, he could feel it. The connection. A thread of something unseen tying him to Ariel, to the energy that now thrummed beneath his skin. He wasn't the same. Ariel stepped back, studying him with an unreadable expression. "It is done," she said softly. Danny lifted his gaze to hers, and for a moment, they just stood there, the silence stretching between them, filled with the weight of everything that had just happened. He could still feel the echoes of power coursing through him, like a second pulse beneath his own, something ancient, something more. And yet, despite all of it, he was still himself. Different, yes, but still Danny. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "So," he muttered, his voice rough, "what now?" Ariel tilted her head, the faintest hint of a smile ghosting across her lips. "Now," she said, "we make sure they never come for us again." The night air was still, heavy with the aftermath of what had happened. Danny stood at the edge of the clearing, staring out into the darkness, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what had changed. The connection he now felt to Ariel wasn't just something imagined. It was real, a living pulse of energy that hummed beneath his skin, a force that had altered him in ways he couldn't yet understand. He should have been afraid, should have felt like he had lost something of himself, but instead, he felt steady, grounded, like a piece of him that had always been missing had finally fallen into place. Ariel stood beside him, watching the horizon, her silver skin catching the faint glow of the moon. She was different now, too. Not in appearance, but in presence. More solid, more powerful, as if the energy she had once restrained was now fully hers to wield. She turned to look at him, and for the first time since they had met, her expression held something close to relief. "You are adjusting faster than I expected," she said quietly. Danny let out a slow breath, flexing his fingers, feeling the strange undercurrent of power that hadn't been there before. "Yeah, well," he muttered, "not like I had much of a choice." The moment stretched between them, filled with things neither of them said. They had won, at least for now. The men who had chased them, who had tried to take Ariel, were gone, scattered by the force of what she had done. But Danny knew it wasn't over. It wouldn't be that easy. People like that didn't just disappear. They would regroup, rebuild, and come back stronger. And when they did, they would be ready for him, for her, for whatever they had become together. Ariel seemed to sense his thoughts because she reached out, resting a hand lightly on his arm. The moment she touched him, the hum of energy between them strengthened, steady and certain. "They will come again," she said, her voice calm. "But now, they will not find us unprepared." Danny met her gaze, feeling the certainty in her words, the quiet promise that whatever happened next, they would face it together. He nodded. "Then we'll be ready." They stood there for a while, side by side, as the first light of dawn began creeping over the horizon. It wasn't the ending Danny had expected, but maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better.